Sarah's life felt like a monotonous cycle. Picture the kind where you're married to a perfectly nice but uninspiring man, living in a suburban enclave where the highlight is the occasional neighborhood barbecue. She wasn't unhappy per se, but she was incredibly bored. It was the kind of ennui that infiltrates your soul, leaving you restless and pushing you towards decisions you wouldn't usually make. That's what led her to the dimly lit bar she'd heard rumors about, whispers hinting at a touch of mystery, a hint of danger. With a determined stride and dressed in a subtly daring outfit, she entered the bar. She wasn't looking for attention, just a break from the dullness of her routine. The bar matched her expectations, dark, smoky, and inhabited by people who seemed to harbor secrets. Almost immediately, she noticed a group of sharply dressed men at a corner table. Their aura of self-assurance was palpable. They weren't boisterous, their mere presence commanded respect and drew eyes. It didn't take long before one of them caught her eye, tall, dark, and just the right amount of dangerous. He was the type of man who knew exactly what he wanted, and right then, it seemed like he wanted Sarah. He made his way over to her, and before she knew it, they were deep in conversation. It was all very innocent at first, but you could tell there was something bubbling under the surface with every word. He spoke with a subtle flirtation that made Sarah's heart race in a way it hadn't in years. Then he offered to buy her a drink. Now, Sarah wasn't stupid, she knew what this meant. Accepting that drink would be crossing a line, one that she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. But then again, wasn't that the whole point of being there, to feel alive, to do something reckless? She hesitated just for a second before she found herself nodding as she took the drink from his hand. She could feel the thrill coursing through her veins. It was like she was doing something dirty, something wrong, and that was what made it so irresistible. The conversation between them grew more intimate, the words more charged with unspoken desires. He had this way of talking that made Sarah feel like she was the only woman in the room, hell, the only woman in the world. When he lightly touched her hand, it was like a bolt of electricity shot through her body. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt anything like that. His touch was soft, deliberate, and it sent a shiver down her spine. Then he leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper, and suggested they move somewhere more private, just him, her, and his friends. The suggestion was so brazen, so outrageous, that it took Sarah's breath away. But instead of backing out, instead of saying no like she should have, she found herself nodding. It was insane, really. Here she was, a married woman, agreeing to go somewhere private with a man she had just met and his friends, no less. But that was the thing about the forbidden, it made you do things that didn't make sense. They made their way to a secluded room in the back of the bar, a place that felt almost secretive. The lighting was low, the furniture plush, and the atmosphere was charged with something dark and erotic. It was like stepping into a different world, one where the rules didn't apply and Sarah could be whoever she wanted to be, even if that person was someone who did things she never thought she would. And just like that, she was in too deep with no intention of turning back. This wasn't some silly flirtation. This was the real deal. As Sarah crossed that threshold into the unknown, she knew one thing for sure, there was no going back to her old life after this. The line had been crossed, and what lay ahead was a path of no return, filled with everything she'd been too scared to admit she wanted. In that secluded room, Sarah was surrounded, and you could practically feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. These men didn't need to say a word, their intentions were written all over their faces. It wasn't that she couldn't see it coming, but being in the middle of it was a whole different story. They were closing in, and she was the prize, plain and simple. One of them, the one who seemed to have taken the lead, leaned in so close she could feel his breath on her neck. It was warm and sent a shiver straight down her spine. Then he had the nerve to ask her if she'd ever thought about cheating on her husband. He said it like he already knew the answer, like he could see straight into her thoughts. Let me tell you, Sarah's heart was pounding. She knew she should have bolted right then and there, but instead, what did she do? She admitted it, just came right out and said that, yeah, she'd thought about it a lot. The moment those words left her mouth, there was no taking them back. You could see the way the men looked at each other, exchanging those smug, knowing glances, like they'd just won some kind of twisted game. Their smiles were pure predator, they could smell the vulnerability on her like sharks scenting blood in the water. She was practically handing herself over to them, and they were more than ready to take what she was offering. The stranger, the one who had been chatting her up at the bar, took her hand and gently led her over to a plush couch in the corner. His touch was electric, sending waves of desire through her that she hadn't felt in years. It was like he knew exactly how to get under her skin, and she was more than happy to let him. As soon as they reached the couch, he started kissing her, soft, teasing kisses that drove her wild. The craziest part was that the other men were watching, just standing there, their eyes locked on her as if they were waiting their turn. The thrill of being the center of attention like that was intoxicating. She could feel her arousal building, stoked by the fact that she was being watched and desired by all of them. The kiss deepened, and with it, Sarah's control slipped away. Thoughts of her husband, the life they'd built together, all started to fade into the background. It was like none of that mattered anymore, not when she had these men surrounding her, ready to give her the kind of excitement she'd been craving for so long. Then, just when she thought she couldn't take any more, another man stepped forward. He ran his hand down her back, and instead of pulling away, she leaned into his touch, her body responding in ways she hadn't expected. The feeling of multiple hands on her body, the sensation of being claimed by them, was just too intoxicating to resist. And then it started. The men began to undress her slowly, each touch deliberate, as if they were savoring every moment. They took their time peeling away her clothes piece by piece, exposing her inch by inch. It was almost ceremonial the way they went about it like. They were unwrapping a gift they'd been dying to get their hands on, and Sarah was helpless to stop it. Lost in the haze of lust and betrayal that was only growing stronger with each passing second, this wasn't just crossing a line, this was leaping over it, burning the bridge, and never looking back. Sarah was already lost by the time they finished undressing her. Her clothes lay in a careless heap on the floor, leaving her completely exposed. Vulnerable, sure, but that vulnerability, it wasn't fear, it was fuel. The way those men looked at her like she was the most precious thing in that room lit something inside her that she hadn't felt in years. They weren't just taking her in with their eyes, they were admiring her, praising every inch of her body, and damn if that didn't make her feel like the most desirable woman alive. Then, before she could even catch her breath, one of them dropped to his knees in front of her. No hesitation, no shame, he gently parted her thighs, his fingers trailing over her skin, making her breath hitch in her throat. The anticipation was killing her, and when he finally began exploring her with his mouth, she thought she might actually explode from the sheer intensity of it. Her head fell back, and the sounds that came out of her, let's just say, weren't anything close to the polite moans you'd expect from a woman like her. It was as if she'd forgotten everything, her marriage, her life back home, all of it. The only thing that existed in that moment was the pleasure these men were giving her, and they weren't holding back. Each of them took their turn touching her, kissing her, making sure she was on the edge but never quite letting her fall over. It was torture in the best way possible, a perfectly coordinated assault on her senses that left her a quivering mess. The more they touched her, the more her inhibitions melted away. All the walls she'd built up over the years were gone, replaced by a desperate, aching need for more. She wanted everything they had to give and then some. When one of them leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear, he whispered if she wanted them all. She didn't even hesitate, she nodded, her voice barely a whisper as she begged them not to stop. There was no turning back now, she was in this all the way. That's when they started undressing themselves. Let me tell you, Sarah was transfixed. She couldn't tear her eyes away, watching as each man revealed more of himself, every movement deliberate and dripping with intent. The atmosphere in the room was thick with anticipation, like the air itself was charged with electricity. She knew exactly what was coming, but the reality of it, that was something else entirely. They positioned her on the couch, her body trembling not from fear but from pure, unfiltered anticipation. Every nerve in her body was on fire, her mind racing as she tried to prepare herself for what was about to happen. But how do you prepare for something like this? You don't. You just surrender, let go, and let whatever is going to happen, happen. And that's exactly what she did. They didn't waste any time. Once she was settled on that couch, it was like a silent agreement passed between them. One of the men, the one who seemed to take the lead in this twisted game, gently guided her mouth to him. No hesitation, no second-guessing, just pure, raw desire driving every move. And while she was focused on him, the others didn't just stand by idly, they were everywhere, touching her in ways that sent her mind spinning. Completely overwhelmed by the sensations flooding her body as she took him in, another man positioned himself behind her, his hands firm on her hips. There wasn't any uncertainty in his movements, he knew exactly what he wanted, and Sarah could feel it the moment he entered her. It was as if her entire world tilted on its axis. Her mind raced, barely able to keep up with what was happening, but the sheer intensity of being filled from both sides left her breathless, craving more even as she struggled to keep up with the sensations. They didn't rush it, that would have been too easy, too simple. No, these men were all about taking their time, drawing out the pleasure until it was almost unbearable. The rhythm they established was slow, torturous, as if they were savoring every second. Each thrust, each touch was calculated to prolong her pleasure, pushing her further toward the edge without letting her tip over. It was maddening in the best possible way, and Sarah couldn't get enough of it. Their words didn't help either. They whispered to her, their voices low and seductive, promising things that drove her wild with desire. Every murmur, every encouragement only made her want them more, made her more desperate to please them, to be exactly what they wanted her to be. As the pace quickened, Sarah felt herself slipping, teetering on the edge of control. Her body was no longer her own, it was theirs, reacting to every touch, every command with a need she hadn't realized. She was capable, but the man in front of her didn't hold back. He thrust deeper, filling her throat until she could barely breathe. The sensation was like nothing she'd ever experienced before, it was both thrilling and terrifying. The sharp line between pleasure and pain blurred until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. She tried to keep up, to match their rhythm, but it was too much. The intensity of it all overwhelmed her, her eyes watering as she struggled for breath, yet craving more of the same. It was a perfect storm of sensation, every nerve in her body lit up, every thought drowned out by the sheer need that consumed her. She was completely lost in it, no longer thinking about her husband or her life outside that room. None of that mattered anymore. All that mattered was what was happening right then, in that moment, as these men took her to places she never thought she'd go. And despite everything, or maybe because of it, she didn't want it to stop. She wanted more, no matter how overwhelming, no matter how much it blurred the lines she once thought were so clear. They didn't ease up, not even for a second. If anything, the men only got more aggressive, their movements more deliberate, more demanding. Sarah was being pushed further than she ever thought she could go, beyond any limit she'd imagined. It wasn't just physical, it was mental and emotional. Every part of her was being dragged through this wild, uncontrollable storm of lust and desire. There was no escape, no pause to catch her breath. They were relentless, and she was losing herself in it, her thoughts completely clouded by a primal need she didn't even know existed inside her. All she could think about was how much she wanted to please them, to be exactly what they wanted, to be used by them in every way they could think of. It was like a switch had flipped in her mind, and nothing else mattered. The line between who she was and what she was doing blurred until it didn't exist anymore. One of them grabbed her hair, yanking her head back sharply as he thrust into her mouth. His grip was unyielding, making it clear. Who was in control? There was no gentleness left, just raw, overpowering dominance. She didn't fight it, she couldn't. All she could do was let it happen, her body reacting on instinct, giving them exactly what they demanded. It was intoxicating, that feeling of being taken, of having no say in what was happening. The others didn't let up either, they continued to take her from behind, their hands gripping her hips so tightly it was as if they were trying to mold her to their will. Their voices were low, almost growling, as they urged her on, pushing her further, harder, deeper into the abyss they'd created for her. Every nerve in her body was on fire, every sensation heightened to an almost unbearable degree. She was burning up from the inside out, driven closer and closer to the edge with every thrust, every touch, every whisper. The more they pushed, the more she felt herself slipping, losing control, losing any sense of who she was. The line between pain and pleasure didn't exist anymore, it was all the same now, this overwhelming intensity that consumed her completely. They were driving her to the brink, pushing her to that point of no return, and she couldn't stop it, didn't want to stop it. Her screams of pleasure were muffled, trapped by the man who still filled her throat, her body convulsing as she teetered on the edge of consciousness. It was too much, too intense, too everything. And yet it was exactly what she needed, what she'd been craving for so long. Her body was barely able to keep up, every muscle trembling, every breath a struggle as they pushed her to her absolute limits and beyond. But this wasn't about her anymore, it wasn't about her needs or her desires. It was about them, about what they could take from her, how far they could push her, how completely they could claim her. In that moment, she wasn't Sarah, the wife, the woman with a life outside this room. She was just theirs, and they weren't about to let go. When Sarah thought she couldn't take it anymore, one of the men pulled away, leaving her gasping for air. Her body trembled from the sheer exhaustion of it all. It wasn't just physical, it was everything, mental, emotional. She was spent, drained in a way she hadn't thought possible. Yet the sensation of his absence made her body ache in a way she hadn't expected. And those men? They just laughed, not the kind of laugh you'd hear after a shared joke, but something darker, more satisfied. They stood there admiring their handiwork, the marks they'd left on her body. Every bruise, every red mark was a testament to the night's events, a reminder that she'd given herself over to them completely. They'd taken what they wanted and were damn proud of it. As they began to dress, Sarah was left sprawled on the couch, her mind still reeling from the intensity of it all. She couldn't move, couldn't think straight, only replaying the night's events in her head. The images were sharp and vivid, like something out of a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and sex, the room still echoing with the remnants of what had happened. One of the men, the one who'd started it all, leaned down close to her ear. His voice was low and menacing as he whispered that this was their little secret, a warning laced in his words. He made it clear that she should think twice before ever crossing that line again. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a threat, plain and simple. Sarah knew better than to argue. She was in too deep now. Once they were gone, she was left alone in that room, her body aching from the strain, her throat raw from the way they'd used her. But it wasn't just her body that hurt, her mind was a mess, flooded with guilt, shame, and disturbingly, arousal. She couldn't shake the feeling of that dark thrill still pulsing through her veins, mixing with the remorse that was slowly creeping in. As she dressed slowly, the full impact of her actions began to dawn on her. She had crossed an irreparable line, committing a betrayal so deep it seemed unforgivable. The burden of this betrayal weighed heavily on her, almost unbearable. She understood there was no way to undo what had happened, no chance to erase it. While guilt consumed her, there was also a lingering desire she was reluctant to confront, a craving for the darkness she had experienced tonight. She staggered out of the bar, her legs weak and her heart pounding as if she had just run a marathon. The night's events replayed relentlessly in her mind, each recollection more vivid and piercing than the last. It was like a film she couldn't stop watching, no matter how hard she tried. Every detail was etched into her memory, and she was terrified by its intensity. She found herself wanting to relive it. As she hailed a cab, she attempted to compose herself, but her thoughts remained a chaotic mix of emotions. The thrill of her actions, the allure of their forbidden nature, still gripped her. Yet, the guilt, crushing and suffocating, was equally overpowering. She felt completely unraveling. Upon arriving home, the house was dark and silent. She entered, her legs still trembling, and saw her husband asleep on the couch, blissfully unaware of the turmoil she had endured. The sight of him, so innocent and oblivious, hit her like a blow to the stomach. Shame engulfed her, so profound it made her feel ill. But beneath it all, hidden away, was the dark, lingering desire she couldn't let go of. She stood there for a long moment, gazing at him, her thoughts still racing, before eventually turning away. There was no turning back from what she had done, no returning to the person she used to be. And the most unsettling part was that she wasn't even sure she wanted to.